I know all of you know who our speaker is this evening, but I still feel it my responsibility and privilege to introduce her. Professor Catharine Stimpson is one of the pioneers in the study of women and gender and a founder of feminist criticism. She taught her first class on women's studies on images of women in literature in 1969, a date which is relevant to the series in which this talk is embedded. That is 1968 to 2018. Once the editor of a book series for the University of Chicago Press, I'm going to use the podium.
See?
See?
It's not just my individual podium fetish.
It is. She's also the founding editor of Signs, the Journal of Women in Culture and Society, the author of a book, a novel, because she's not busy enough writing criticism, class notes, and the editor of 7 books, and also published over 150 monographs, essays, stories, and reviews in such places as the Transatlantic Review, Nation, New York Times Book Review, Critical Inquiry, and Boundary 2. She has served as the co-editor of a 2-volume Library of America edition of the works of Gertrude Stein. She's lectured at approximately 400 institutions and events in the United States and abroad. Her public service has included serving as the chair of the New York State Council for the Humanities, the National Council for Research on Women, and the Ms. Magazine Board of Scholars. In 1990, she was president of the Modern Language Association. She is now a member of the board of directors of several educational, philanthropic, and cultural organizations, and a former member of the board of PBS. From September 2000 through September 2001, she served as president of the Association of Graduate Schools. And I'm omitting her service to New York University, hoping that the students are all aware of it. She is recognized for her transdisciplinarity and intersectional approach. From Publishers Weekly on her book, Where the Meanings Are, Feminism in Cultural Spaces, a book of essays in literary criticism, feminist theory, and race relations, originally published in 1988 and reissued in 2014, and soon to be in, if not already in, our library on campus for students to, to refer to, both in the LPD library and in the library in Levy. Publishers Weekly said, she contemplates whether there is a unique feminine sensibility in literature, studies blacks and women as victims of white patriarchal culture, and defines a central task of feminism as the exposing of misrepresentations of women in mass media, everyday speech, and religion. Maybe we can discuss some of those issues here tonight. We are privileged to have Professor Stimpson here in Florence as part of an LPD dialogue for the second time, as part of our series, as I mentioned before, suggestively entitled Year of Revolt, 1968 to 2018. I wrote 2008, I'm a little behind. Anyway, she came first in the fall of 2016 during the presidential campaign. Her talk then, a recording of which is on the LPD website, which I refer you to, helped us think through the issues of gender and reflected impatience and anger about the campaign, and anxiety and discomfort about possible outcomes of the campaign. I think it is fair to say that much of that anxiety and discomfort was warranted. On the other side of the election, it is our hope that the wisdom of the long view will help us to think through issues and possible responses facing us today. So please join me in welcoming warmly our friend, Kate Stimpson.
Thank you.
I turn over the podium to you.
And I will make the delicate walk down these treacherous steps.
Take the rest of your microphone. Do you want the water now?
no, I'm fine, thanks. Okay, let's make a ceremony out of everything. Ellen, how much time do we want left for questions? Because I look at the audience and I love La Pietra and I love the people who are here. So how much time
20
for?
minutes. Let's split our time between your talk and.
So how long do you want me to blab and how long for questions?
The total.
For the talk, and then I have to.
Well, I think it's cruel and unusual punishment to have to sit and listen to someone talk for a whole hour. Even though this is not a podium, this is a pulpit. So let's make an arrangement with each other. I will talk maybe 40 minutes, then we'll have room for questions. But please, as I talk, interrupt me. You can interrupt me and say, I've never heard such foolishness in my entire life. You can interrupt me and say, what did you mean by that? But please, if you have questions, or if you simply can't hear me in the back of the room, if I mumble, raise your hands and say, Kate, you're mumbling, please stop it. So let's make this a conversation. Give me about 40 minutes, my watch is right in front of me, for a quasi-monologue, but questions, comments as we go, and then questions, because we're not talking about easy things, and we're not talking about simple things. But there is one thing that's really easy to say, and that is to praise Ellen Toscana for everything she has done for La Pietra. So thank you, Ellen, very much for asking me back. I'm always happy to be here. I understand among the students that some of you are fresh persons. How many of you are fresh persons here? You're fresh, okay. Well, welcome. I understand that some of the fresh people have been here for both the fall semesters, but if this is your first time here, have a wonderful, wonderful time in La Pietra. I also am very much looking forward to the talk tomorrow night at 6 o'clock on Italian feminism. I think our two talks will dovetail. And I have to say, my first march about women was in the late 1960s. And we were always very jealous because the Italian feminists had the best marches. They had the best songs. They had the best costumes. They had the best spirit. And so we frumpy Americans, you know, we'd walk down the street with a sign saying really exciting things like, down with patriarchy. And, you know, we'd be wearing sweatshirts. And the Italian feminists always looked so great. And we would always think, how do you really do a great march and demonstration? Look to Rome, look to Milan, look to Florence, look to Naples. That is where art meets demonstration. I also am glad that we have both students in the community here. So here we go. And you will see me occasionally look down at my script because I so respect La Pietra. I didn't want to come here and just talk off the cuff or just blab away. So I will be working with a script. And if you see me looking down, I'm not in prayer. I am just checking my script. So here we go. Women are in revolt. Women of all races are in revolt. What a simple statement this is. What an exhilarating statement this is. And so today, together, let's talk about the nature and the meanings of this revolt. And as we begin, will you please, in your mind's eye, see two vivid images. The first image is of famous women walking on a red carpet. They are attending the Golden Globes. We all know what this is a global reference, right? Awards on January 7th of this year. And many of the women are walking 2 by 2. And in these couplings, one is an actress, one is an activist for women's causes, including the African American woman who first invented the phrase, "Me Too," many years ago. Several of the actresses have founded or contributed to the Time's Up initiative, a legal fund for economically disadvantaged women who need legal help with sexual harassment. And the women on this red carpet are all wearing black. The second image. The second image is of a line of famous women who are performing together. They are the stars of the Grammy Awards in New York on January 28th of this year. And they are boldly singing a song written by their lead singer, Kesha. And the song is called Praying. And all this lineup of women are wearing white dresses or white pantsuits. So there we have the colors of a revolt: black, white, red, gold, and soon the color pink, no longer being a color of girly. The color pink will join them. This revolt is global, though it varies from country to country. In China, a PhD student from a well-known university in Beijing exposes the sexual harassment of her mentor, a famous professor. Other women then called for anti-harassment mechanisms on their campus. And the Chinese government looks on warily, very warily. The revolt is not only global. Spread by the internet, it is moving at warp speed. And what is happening? What is the revolt about? They're in revolt because men have power over them and are using that power to abuse, dominate, and harm them. And to the men in this audience, I want to praise the band of men who support women in this revolt. Even the most advanced technology companies, like Uber, can be scenes of frat house culture. Sexually, men have been harassing women and girls, assaulting women and girls, violating women and girls, raping women and girls. Some men have been threatening women and girls if women do not submit to this harassment, assault, violation, and rape. Men have been warning women that they will be mocked, they will be laughed at, they will be disbelieved if they complain. I must say words that come from the current president of the United States. I want to tell you quite frankly, I have a Trump supporter in my family. There are some things that make conversations difficult. We did not celebrate Thanksgiving with him, right? Even worse, women will lose economic chances and jobs if they complain. They may be physically hurt and beaten up. And this evil is not the only evil in the world. There are other evils in the world, but this is one of them, and a huge one. And now, at last, women and men are saying, enough is enough. Women have come to believe that they have the power, individually and collectively, to stop the pain. The revolt of women is angry and defiant, but this is crucial. It is also nonviolent. Women are acting by telling their stories, by marching with their friends and their families, by starting legal defense funds. Crucially, women are not picking up semi-automatic pistols and AK-47s. You will not see a gun in that group. you will see posters. Instead, women are picking up, not guns, they're picking up their voices, individually and collectively. They are an army of witnesses. And as women speak, what are they telling us? What are we telling each other? They are telling us about the ways in which they were silenced by their abusers, by their enablers, by their families, by powerful institutions. And so the language that we hear now shatters decades of being shut up and shut down. I'm sure you all know one famous story of grooming and abuse that went on for decades. Does the name Larry Nassar mean anything? What a bastard. Dr. Lawrence G. Nassar, that famous gymnastics doctor, who was protected and enabled by gymnastics organizations and by Michigan State University, where he worked. He was finally arrested for child pornography. And then all the rest came out. Some people, including parents, protested. Some newspaper reporting spoke of his sins. Then, as you know, after he was found guilty in courts, at his sentencing hearings, his victims could speak. I teach law and literature at New York University. And one of the things I want my team teacher and I to teach next year is the long statement by Allie Raceman about her abuse. Multitudes of children and women whom he had abused spoke in court. They had a legal podium. There have been over 265 reports from these women. Not one, not two, not 65, 265. Yes, it's astonishing, isn't it? Their testimonies are harrowing. Said one, Annie Labrie, quote unquote, "We have been conditioned for years to obey at all costs." And here's the voice of that Allie Raceman, an Olympic gymnast, winner of 3 gold medals. She said that Nassar had molested her even at the 2012 Olympic Games where she was competing. And she addressed this man whom the women called a monster directly. And she said, quote, "The tables have turned, Larry. We are here. We have our voices, and we are not going anywhere." And there are other celebratory voices. Do you remember what happened in January? Saudi women and girls were at last permitted to go out in public, and they were permitted to go to a soccer game. So there are terrific sounds and images of these women cheering on. What was it like? Tell us. Yeah.
Thank you. Everyone was, it was also an intense game in terms of who was playing. And so everyone, when the winning team won, everyone was like, "It's because of the girls. We need the girls in the podium." And so it was kind of nice. It was refreshing. It was different.
Well, thank you for that. I wish I'd been there, but I'm very glad that you were. Thank you. Okay. So in brief, what is this revolt doing? It is tearing apart the bonds between women's bodies and men's power over those bodies. And let me give you a truncated timeline of the phenomenon, how the revolt has built in the United States. January 20th, 2017, is the inauguration of Donald J. Trump as President of the United States. January 21, 2017, there are the huge women's marches in the US and around the world. And many of the women are wearing pink pussy hats. And so pink becomes another color of revolt. And then many of the women enter politics almost for the first time. Now, my partner, Elizabeth Wood, and I were on that march with grandchildren. I have to tell you, frankly, the grandchildren are really bored. 9-year-old girls, can we go home now? Can we have a McDonald's, please? Right? And the reports came in. 200,000 in Boston. Hundreds of thousands in New York. The report in the March in Washington was so big that you couldn't go hear the speakers. So you just had to haul these 9-year-old twin girls around the mall, listening to them become increasingly desirous of getting out of there. Okay, October 5th, 2017. The New York Times publishes a detailed story about the decades of allegations of harassment by Harvey Weinstein, the powerful movie producer. And among the women who come forward are two well-known actresses, Ashley Judd and Rose McGowan. And a recurrent memory that all these women have, these women who finally spoke, a recurrent meeting is of going to what they thought would be a business meeting. And Weinstein comes in wearing a bathrobe. Charlie Rose, who was forced out of his media jobs after women complained. Another complaint about him was he would walk around the office in his bathrobe. You have to ask, what's with these bathrobes? What is with these bathrobes? The allegations spread throughout arts, media, and entertainment, and most of the men denied the allegations and then apologized if they were misunderstood and claimed the sex was consensual. January 2, 2018, Al Franken, the progressive senator from Minnesota, resigns after allegations about his behavior and the publication of an inappropriate photo from his days as a comedian. The Democratic women in the Senate pressure him to do so. January 5th through 7th, 2018, the American Economics Association meets in Philadelphia, and professional women economists document the demeaning comments about them during their job searches and the pervasive discrimination against them in the profession. January 27th, 2018, Steve Wynn, a powerful and wealthy casino owner in Las Vegas, resigns as finance chairman of the Republican National Committee because of charges of harassment, exploitation, and rape over many years. Yesterday, on February 6th, yesterday, he resigns as CEO and chairman of the Wynn Resorts. And this predator has about 11,000 women in his employment. Manicurists, secretaries, jobs on the gaming tables, housekeepers changing the sheets. About 11,000 women were dependent on him for their employment. And then January and February 2018, in these courtrooms in the state of Michigan, Larry Nassar has to sit in his prison garb and handcuffs. He has to sit and listen to scores and scores of women tell their stories of his abuse. And that's only a brief chronology of some of the signal moments in this revolt. Now, inevitably, the revolt is generating a backlash. Isn't that an interesting word? Backlash. With the word lash in it. Backlash. Let's distinguish between the backlash and the search in which we must all engage about a spectrum of meanings of harassment. Is there a difference among a bad date, harassment, being shouted at the street, actual assault, and rape? Is there a spectrum of violations? And if so, how do we, women and men, construct it morally and legally? And that's part of what's going on. But there is a backlash, a real backlash. One came in France, I'm sure you all read about it. 100 French women, including the actress Catharine Stimpson, who did very brave things when she was younger, published a letter in the French paper Le Monde attacking the French equivalent of the Me Too movement. And you remember what the terms of the backlash there were. The Me Too movement and its French equivalent are, according to the letter, totalitarian, puritanical, and anti-man. It will destroy the pleasures of seduction and flirtation. And the letter said, this letter is very American. We're importing American Puritanism. You look puzzled. They did. The French were seen as the place of seduction and pleasure and love. And America was seen as the place of meanness, nastiness, Puritanism, and don't do anything except in marriage and then do it in the Mike Pence way. And then that letter inspired its own debate. But in the United States, oh, it's so wonderful to be an American, the gender traditionalists are frothing away. One example of a gender traditionalist is from the state of Missouri. There, Claire McCaskill, a moderate and feminist senator, is up for re-election in a few months, 2018. But a follower of Trump, President Trump, wishes to run against him. Remember his name, Cortland Sykes. Remember his words. I'm going to quote them at some length because they're not atypical. Quote, I'm now channeling Cortland Sykes, and I'm sure Cortland Sykes would be appalled to think that I'm channeling him in this context. Quote, I don't buy into radical feminism's crazy definition of modern womanhood, and I never did. They, the radical feminists, made it up to suit their own nasty, snake-filled heads. I don't buy the nonstop feminism campaign against manhood. I want to come home to a home-cooked dinner at 6 every night. One that my fiancé fixes, and one that I expect one day to have my daughters learn to fix. I don't want them to grow up to be career-obsessed banshees who become nail-biting, manophobic, hell-bent feminist she-devils. And all this is on his Facebook page. So my fellow banshees, my fellow she-devils, Cortland Sykes doesn't like us. But the eruptivist revolt is significant in and of itself. Me Too is calling out a disgusting, despicable practice. But it exists in a historical context, and that is a long, deep revolt against our systems of gender themselves. And what do I mean by gender systems? As you all know, gender is the organization of sexual difference. In other words, the systems that manage sexual difference. The fact that most of us, but by no means all of us, are born into one biological sex or another, although there's a significant group that we call intersex. I was born female. My brothers were born male. But we were born into a system, a gender system, that organized all this. And gender is so at work. Every time I look at my passport, I look at the information that my government wants of me. My name, of course, my address, when my last passport was issued, what's my nationality? Do they ask me for my IQ? Do they ask me for my number of family members? Do they ask me if I'm nasty or nice? That would be hard to answer. No, I have to check. You all did it. You check a box called M or F. You have a gender identification on your passport. And gender is at work in our politics and our government. Men have more power publicly than women, and this is called patriarchy, the rule of our fathers. And that girl child gymnast was, quote unquote, conditioned to obey. Conditioned to obey. Gender's at work, in our traditional division of labor. And I can't resist saying this. The Judeo-Christian tradition has an explanation for that division of labor. And one of the things about coming to Florence is you see so extraordinary representations of the source of that division of labor. It's called the Garden of Eden. And where Eve ate of the apple, tempted by the snakes. And when I read Cortland Sykes talking about my snake-filled head, I couldn't help but think of the Garden of Eden, that myth, and Eve with her head filled with temptation by the wicked snake. Culture is also at work in our cultural symbols and ideologies. Gender's at work in our leisure activities. I found it fascinating that when Donald Trump had to listen to the women to his bragging, his sexual braggadocio on the bus in an interview with Billy Bush, I found it interesting it was all dismissed as locker room banter, a place where some men talk, although many athletes said this is not how we talk in the locker room. By the way, go Eagles. And gender is also at work in our psychological identities, our sense of self. What is our sense of self? Male, female, masculine, feminine, genderqueer, breaking the binary. But gender's at work in our psychological construction of the self. Now, when we understand how systematic gender is, when we understand how pervasive and profound it is, and when we also examine its links with other systems and other hierarchies, we can begin to answer the question, why did women keep silent about their abuse? And why did some women enable that abuse? I think we all know the answers. Let me spell them out, but you already know them. Of course, some of the women signed settlements with their abusers. A manicurist who said she was raped by Steve Wynn signed a settlement for $7.5 million. But with the settlement comes a confidentiality agreement. One of Trump's girlfriends, stage name Stormy Daniels, took a settlement and also signed a non-disclosure agreement. Ellen, what's the legal term for that? Confidentiality agreement, yeah. So they were shut up legally. Take the money and shut up. Another reason, women are afraid. Psychologically, physically, and economically. No one can live in total bravado. Everyone is afraid of something at some time. Everyone is anxious about something at some time. And women are afraid to speak about the abuse. And if they do, they're convinced realistically they will not be believed. Or they will go to a human resource office in their employer. And I've seen this happen. And the human resource office will put up a lot of barriers. So women say, why should I complain? I won't be believed. Still other women are socialized to compliance. Think of that girl gymnast. Here's the doctor, obey. Here's your trainer, obey. But some girls suppress their own knowledge. Here's part of the importance of the work of the psychologist Carol Gilligan, who's been here, hasn't she? No. Okay. Anyway, Carol Gilligan, in her findings, says when boys and girls grow up, each learns to bury something. The boys learn to bury their friendships with other men, not locker room banter, but real friendships where they reveal their vulnerabilities. And what are the girls taught to do? The girls are taught to suppress what they know. So they have lockers of knowledge. Let me take the term from the military, hurt lockers. They have hurt lockers of knowledge that they do not speak of, but they know. But they know without speaking. And still other women may be fatalistic. Well, this is the way things work. This is how things work. I know women of deep faith who say this is the world that God wants. This is the world that God has constructed. So their faith and their compliance are inseparable. But then, all those reasons for silence, why do revolts take place? What is the cause of revolts? Well, our historians can help us. Correctly, our historians warn us that revolts must be placed in a context. 2,000 years ago, if a Tuscan woman slapped away her husband's hand, it would be in a very different historical context from Melania Trump coming down an airplane for a stop in Israel, slapping away Donald Trump's hand. Same gesture, different contexts. But historians also tell us that revolts build up. This was not a lightning strike, though it was triggered by Trump's election. Revolts build up. They're not lightning strikes, they're more like volcanoes that then erupt. But perhaps too simplistically, I believe that revolts happen when people can no longer bear the conditions of their life. They may be facing death in war or in a prison or in a concentration camp. They may be starving. They may fear for their children. They may long for dignity, for freedom, for opportunity. Whatever their particular condition, they will rise up, even in the face of death. And they will rise up because they cannot bear what is happening. They will challenge, they will disrupt, they will subvert, they'll seek change because the gender system has become too heavy, too unfair, too painful, too damaging to bear any longer. But this contemporary revolt, this cry that we will not bear this any longer. We will continue to bear children, but we will not bear with this any longer. It does have a history. It has two rich histories. And because of my promise to you, I'm going to name the histories, but just talk about one. The two rich histories are the history of feminist activism, though under any name, and the second rich history is the LGBTQ movement, which has disrupted gender systems in such often a sassy fashion. But you must forgive me because maybe we'll get to it in the question period, but we have these two histories that are behind that. I also think, quite frankly, that it's Title IX that gave women equal access to athletics in college, which also has made some difference. But the feminist history, it goes back for millennia. But feminism, as an organized movement, emerges in the 19th century, and it had other names. Sometimes it was simply called the women's movement. It was inseparable in England and America from the abolitionist movement, and in the 20th century from the Black civil rights movement. So it was connected, often in tension, with other movements. It consists, this women's movement, of four great waves. And remember that waves overlap. The first wave is dated to 1848. And do you all know the story of where it started? It was a chapel in Seneca. Is anybody here from Seneca Falls, New York? Is anybody here from Rochester, New York? Is anybody here from New York? Okay. Well, there's a chapel in Seneca Falls, New York, and a group of men and women met there in 1848, including the great abolitionist, African-American Frederick Douglass. One of the leaders among the women was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, married to a man named Henry, a real grump. And Henry said, if you go there, I'm going to leave home. And she went there, and he did leave home. But he came back later, of course. And they did the Seneca Falls Declaration, one of the great documents of liberation. They took the Declaration of Independence, The 1776 Declaration of Independence, and you know the famous sentence, all men and women, men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is a fabulous, fabulous political statement by which I live. The Seneca Falls Declaration rewrote the Declaration of Independence, so it now read, all men and women are created equal and endowed with their Creator with inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This first women's movement, this first wave in the United States, then focused on getting the vote. And it became called the suffrage movement. And the women wore white. So the Grammy Awards were looking back to this. And suffrage in America was finally ratified in 1920. Italy was a bit behind. Does anybody know when women's vote came to Italy? 46, 2 years behind France, and several years ahead of Greece. That's the first wave. The second wave starts in the 1960s. Earlier than 68, but 68 is important. And I look back at the second wave, and I'm a grizzled old second waver. And if there was a rubric, it was equal rights. It's very hard looking back at how absurd things were. How absurd that women were not permitted to enter Lamont Library at Harvard, even though they were students at Radcliffe. It was absurd that when we looked at the textbooks, for example, in English literature, women were barely there. The Norton Anthology of Literature had one woman in it, and her name was George Eliot. Her pen name was George. Looking back at the mush, you laugh. The number of women admitted to law school, medical school. My students today, I don't know about you students today, they can't believe it. It just, it's like a bizarre, surreal episode that happened a long time ago. But there were also extraordinary things that happened in the second wave. One was rape, where rape was changed from a sexual crime to a crime of violence. And the raped woman was more apt to be believed. It changed rape law and rape trials. Feminism also became a global movement, but another great thing of the second wave was the exploration of differences among women and the formation of the concept of intersectionality, that we are shaped by many different forces. Our identities are shaped by many different forces. And in this exploration of difference, I had to look at myself and say, it matters that you're white. What does it mean that you were born white? You were bred in a white town? What does this mean in terms of your identity? Second wave. The third great wave was the third wave. The daughters and granddaughters of the second wavers. And I was at one wonderful conference at Barnard College where this very, very chic woman stood up and looked at the older women and said, stop asking us for gratitude. Stop telling us to be grateful for what you second wavers did. The third wave, much more comfortable with diversity, be it national or global. Third wavers, more interested in style, in fashion. The term lipstick lesbian came into use. There was no longer a revolt against looking good, because the theory was if you looked fashionable, you were giving in to patriarchal constructions of femininity. No, said the third wavers. No. The third wavers, command of the social media, digital natives, not digital immigrants. And third wavers expecting to be more entrepreneurial, realizing they were inheriting the gig economy. And at the same time, at the same time, struggling to balance career and family. The second wave struggle was also the third wave struggle. How to balance career and family. And women of color still had to struggle with racial discrimination and marginalization. And now the fourth wave. I would suggest to you, this announces the birth. And like all births, it has a gestation. But only Athena, and she was a goddess, popped without gestation from her father's head. And the fourth wave says, this is Trump's world. We will not live here. We will not bear this. And even more than the third wave, the fourth wave's great organizing tool was the social media. The three women who served as co-chairs. It was done through the social media. And I remember saying, me too. Me too is a hashtag. And I remember I was moderating a panel about what to do after the election. Lots of people, lots of feeling. And a woman stood up and said, I want you all to come to the march. And I said, but where's, I haven't seen flyers, I haven't seen posters. Who's organizing this? Who's getting the permits? Who's making sure they're going to be the toilets? And she just looked at me. And she was about, 30 maybe. Average age in this room, 30. And she said, well, we know how to organize. And I have to admit to a little bit of condescension. And I said, oh, tell me about your, tell me about your experience. And she just looked at me and she said, I do the lighting for rock concerts that have an average of 250,000 people. I do the lighting for these rock concerts. I think I know how to organize a demonstration. I shut up. There we go. But the fourth wave is now the greatest manifestation of the fourth wave, though it's not the only manifestation, is the Me Too movement and the rebellion against. But there are many other things as well, because the rebellion is also economic. I want to earn a living. I do not. One of the actresses that were molested by Weinstein, the actresses said, what chance might we have had if we hadn't had to walk out of that room with that fat man in his bathrobe? What might have happened to us? What might have happened to directors if they had not been harassed off the job? Who knew? Who left things because they were not being treated fairly? But quickly, but the LGBTQ movement, again, not only making all of us, no matter what our sexuality, citizens, which is a radical move, but also the argument against the very binary split that is the heart of gender systems. No, we're not binary. Maybe if we're male, we can become female. Maybe we can float above gender. Call me by my right pronoun. Don't call me he or she. Let's invent a pronoun. And it is tremendously important and very daring. The drag queens are some of the most daring performers in the world, and they too have a historical lineage. But it is this explosion of a concept that is the core of gender systems. Well, it's time for me to give a conclusion. And this would be it. At their strongest and most persistent, people in revolt will seek change. Marches will be more than physical exercise, but marches will mark a path to a better future. Banners will do more than fly in today's winds. Banners will be the bright colors of tomorrow. Red, gold, white, black, pink, the rainbow of gay liberation. Songs will be more than performances to be recaptured on YouTube. Songs will be anthems to be sung again and again. In brief, protest will lead to progress. And we have many guidebooks to progress. Let me leave you with one. It is small, but it is powerful. And its title is We Should All Be Feminists. Take that, Mr. Sykes. And its author is not a grizzled old veteran of the second wave, but a Nigerian woman who was born in 1977 in the middle of the second wave. Third wave, really. Brilliant. She was born in the modern Nigeria that Civil War helped to shape. Educated in Nigeria and the United States, moves between the two. Her name is Chimamanda Adichie. She tells the story of how she became a feminist. And she said, to become a feminist, I had to overcome stereotypes about feminists, including those in African culture. She lists the feminists, quote, the stereotypes about being a feminist. You hate men. Now I'm quoting her. You hate men. You hate bras. You hate African culture. You think women should always be in charge. You don't wear makeup. You don't shave. You're always angry. You don't have a sense of humor. You don't use deodorant. And you'll never be marriageable. Conversations about gender, she reminds us, are difficult. And I'm very grateful to you all for listening to me so courteously. She said, people get irritable with these conversations because these conversations make us ask why in an area of great technological and social change. Why does gender lag behind? One could ask the same question about race. Why do we have the internet? And we have racial and gender and national and other insults. We have created the internet, and we use it for hate, as well as for love and information. She says we still live with the burdens, prescriptions, and stereotypes of gender. But she says, what will change ask of us? And she says, change psychologically asks of us that we both be angry and hopeful. And she writes, gender as it functions today is a grave injustice. I am angry. We should all be angry. Angry has a long history of bringing about positive change. And she adds, but I am also hopeful because I believe deeply in the ability of human beings to remake themselves for the better. Socially, she says, let us educate our boys and girls differently. Permit our boys and permit our girls to grow up without the blinders and binders of gender. She says, the best feminist I know is my brother. And she concludes with a tone of urgency. A feminist is a man or a woman who says, yes, there is a problem with gender as it is today, and we must fix it. We must do better. So I'm a little angry, and I'm a lot hopeful. And I suggest we have a new hashtag. Hashtag, we will do better. Thank you for listening to me. And thank you for letting me, I don't know, I'm a little bit over my 40 minutes, so shame on me, but questions, comments, let's talk. I can't stroll the way I'd like. Yes, I am going to stroll the way I like. I'm going to carry my little mic with me, I think. Yes.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much. I wanted to ask you about a very recent thing that happened with the actress Rosie McGowan, I believe.
Yeah.
Yes. During a talk at Barnes & Noble's, she was questioned by a trans woman what she has done for the trans community, and Rosie is now known as a big name and face in the movement, especially with the Weinstein allegations. And Rosie had a very aggressive response to the trans woman. She was screaming and crying, and the trans woman was eventually let out by security guards. And Rosie even took it to Twitter to continue the conversation. And that brought back to mainstream the dialogue that women and trans women are not often supposed to be in the same movement. So I wanted to know your opinions on that and how women can do better in including trans women also in the movement.
Well, it's a wonderful question. And have been great struggles, especially there are radical feminists who say a woman is a woman. I mean, that oversimplifies. And then, of course, the trans women have psychologically, socially, often medically, made the transition, the journey to being a woman. I think it's an absurd quarrel myself. I care where you are morally. I think it's an absurd quarrel. But be that as it may, what do I think the appropriate response is? These movements need to work together. The trans movement has been extremely important, I believe. And then if we work together, there's something we have to avoid, but we don't seem to be able to do it often enough. And what we have to avoid is saying one, in a kind of yelly way, what have you done for me lately? What have you done for me lately? Making your cause the only cause, and everyone must cohere around it. That, I think, is the first mistake. And the second mistake is when that accusation is made, is to say, to be both angry and hopeful. Angry at being misunderstood, but hopeful that you can then enter into a dialogue or a polylogue. Or I wasn't there in Barnes & Noble. I wasn't there. I think if you're accused of something, sometimes you must shout back. But as you describe it, I think a little bit more patience would have been a little bit more helpful. Because again, as they say, I was cutting about the relationship of the two movements. There are always tensions among movements. There are always tensions. Why, if I'm working with an African American woman, should she trust me unless I have good faith that I have worked on racial issues? You know, you have to earn trust. You have to build trust. It doesn't happen overnight. But if we, you know, there's an old saying, I don't know if it's going to make sense, because capital punishment, hanging is no longer used as much as lethal injection or firing squad or swords. But here's the old saying, if we don't hang together, we will hang separately. If we don't stick together despite the difficulties, we will be subject to divide and conquer. So in the women's marches, when the drag queens come, it's quite a beautiful sight to me. But that's my hope. You know, you're going to choose, the woman who has the mic is going to choose the next speaker. So be fair. Get everybody. Yeah.
Do you think Al Franken should have resigned?
I think you picked up the tone in my voice. I think there might have been other shoes to drop. There might have been other stories to come. I think he should have been given due process. I think that he should have. He said he was going to go to the Senate Ethics Committee. I think that process should have been allowed to take its course. Not only for the sake of Al Franken, whom I respected, but also for the sake of all of us. Because there may come a point, fairly or unfairly, we might be unfairly accused of something. And then we would want due process. So I think it's very important, even in the midst of our anger and rage and revolt, it's very important to remember due process, if due process is really due process. I was at a meeting, and there was an older woman, and there was a man from Minnesota who was 30. Very proud of saying he was 30. And they were talking about Franken, who was a senator, as you all know, from Minnesota. And the older woman said, well, what do you think he should have done? And the man said, I am 30 and everyone of my generation thinks he should have resigned. Yeah, everyone of my generation thinks he should have resigned. And the older woman, why do I say older? She was younger than me, but still. The older woman said, well, I am not so sure. So there may or may not be a generational divide about Franken. I don't know. There may be a generation. But my own feeling was it made me so sad. It made me sad in a way I don't think anybody is sad about Harvey Weinstein. Except maybe a couple of his enablers. I don't think anybody's sad about him. But people are sad about Franken. And it teaches us those bitter lessons that none of us are perfect. And I think, again, I wish that Franken had had due process in the Senate, and I think it may have ended up the same way. But he has resigned. He did bad things. And he did very good things, too. But people disagree about it. I don't know how you feel about it. People disagree about it, yeah. You see, then that comment goes back to something I talked about. That's one of the most serious things we have to look at. Here's the spectrum of behavior. And it's for all of us, even in the midst of a revolt, to think through what we find morally acceptable actions. Or if they're not morally accepted, they're just jerky. They're stupid. Stop being stupid and don't come near me again. So this is something that has to be worked through without ever, ever, ever failing to take women and men who complain seriously.
So one of the things you mentioned was that moving forward, we should teach. Wow, everyone's looking at me. Sorry. We should teach boys that it's okay to share their intimate feelings and girls that it's okay to share their knowledge. How do you think the current education system in the U.S. plays into that, and what type of changes do you think could make it better?
Well, the U.S. is so big. Italy too. I mean, these are big schools, and so some schools are doing it well, and some schools are still gender rigidity. Interestingly enough, one of the best places for this? The U.S. Military Academy at West Point. The military, you go up to their website. You look at women coming out and the leadership roles they're taking in the military. Because when the military decides to do something, they do it. You just have to hope they're doing the right thing. But what should schools do differently? It has to run all the way through the system, that everybody has to be devoted to letting the child develop to his or her or its fullest potential. That starts in pre-K with toys, with the expectations that you have. It also starts, quite frankly, with sports. If you have a school that thinks boys' sports are the cat's pajamas and girls' sports are to be underfunded, something is going wrong there. It also has to do with what you permit children to write in writing classes, how you permit children to express their feelings. So it is an overhaul in my mind. I do know some schools that are doing an overhaul through the lens of fairness and human potential. I think it'll take a long time, and I think it'll be very uneven. And for those of you who've had that kind of schooling, you have good fortune. You had that?
No, I had the opposite.
You had the opposite.
The messy part.
Yeah. But it's a wonderful question, and it's one thing you can look at in your colleges. Those of you who are still in college or university, look at what's happening to you. How are your classes being conducted? What is your curriculum? A lot, too, is, I suppose I really worked on curricular issues. And a little bit less on classroom climate. But I really looked at curricular issues. What are you actually saying? What are you teaching in the curriculum? So that's just, but since gender is everywhere, teaching boys and girls that they need not be captives of gender has to be throughout the educational system. Vague answer, but hard work. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your remarks. And I was thinking that women's history, as part of all of humankind's history, has been filled with revolt and resistance. And as you described, the women in revolt, this movement is going on. But I am a little less optimistic. And my question to you is, how do you see this most recent revolt in some way really addressing the structural inequity and the patriarchal structural inequity, which is so deeply embedded, not only in the United States, but in global economies everywhere?
They will not write on my tombstone, "She saw the end of patriarchy." That simply will not be on my tombstone. One thing that I think is helpful is that the global institutions, like the International Monetary Fund, that they take on the structural inequities that disadvantage lots of men, but disadvantage women more. One place where I would really start, quite frankly, is in literacy rates. How can you survive? Maybe you can. But what do you need to use a computer? Unless you have voice assistants, unless you can say, "Alexa, type for me." I think Alexa's, when they say the civilization of Earth got really flabby, I think they should blame Alexa. But I think if you focus on education and you make sure that the literacy rates are gender neutral. Now there are what I think 9 to 10 countries where women have greater literacy than men. Maybe it's up to 15 by now. But you look at countries that are still agricultural, well, you don't even have to look at that. Are there differential literacy rates? And I think if you really work to give women access, not to a PhD unless she wants it, give women access to literacy. Then you have access to the computer culture. Then you have greater access to microfinancing. And so I think literacy rates, I think economically, everything I read about microfinancing, give women access to the markets. I am not sitting here saying the markets are the greatest thing since the markets, because they're not. But give women access to the markets. The health systems. Access to good prenatal care. And access to maternal health. So I think you take every system one by one, as I'm now doing, and you say, what does that need for gender equity? Giving women a chance. What does it mean in terms of microfinancing and financing? What does it mean in terms of literacy rates in education? What does it mean in terms of maternal health and access to good childbirth? You know, the columnist, the newspaper reporter who's just superb on these issues is Nicholas Kristof. Then go back to the IMF and your global organizations. Do they have gender equity within their own operations? Now, it's true the IMF has a female leader, Christine Lagarde. But what is equity like up and down? What is equity like in the United Nations? What, for example, is going on? I think it's a great organization, the UN Refugee Organization. What's going on in terms of gender equity is it really alert to the rapes that happen to women in exile or refugees. So just do a huge whiteboard and then go through every system one by one, and then people working within that system will have a task, because nobody can do everything. Not even Athena. Nobody can do everything, so where can you help? Where can you, as I say, I placed a lot of my energies into curricular reform, changing what we think and what we teach. That's it. But you're absolutely right to point out, there was a Tuscan woman swatting a man's hand away. You know, it is, and Adichie is pretty realistic about this. Gender systems have been around for a long time. So you take your place in that long line of white and red and black and pink and rainbow and gold. You just take your place in that long line. Knowing it is a long line. As I say, so they write on my tombstone, blah, 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 blah. She hoped to see the end of patriarchy, but she was under no illusions. It's important. You measure the importance of something by its toughness. You know, I can eat an ice cream cone. It's easy. What difference does it make in the world? It's easy. To give milk to starving children. To give milk to children in a drought. To give milk to children who are suffering from famine. That's hard work. Now, where's the mic? Where's our mic holder?
Thank you for your wonderful talk. I wanted to ask, similar to my friend's question earlier, how can, with fourth wave feminism, how can we express and appreciate the very real sentiments and experiences of women while also not kind of reinforcing the preeminence of the gender binary in the gender system? So how do we kind of reconcile those two things, like the real experience of what we feel as women without without reinforcing gender as a preeminent thing?
Great question. And let me see if my answer to you makes any sense. First, the gender system, and here historians of gender like Joan Scott are so important. It's always in danger of collapse. You know, it looks so strong, and it is so strong, but also it takes a lot of work to keep it going. I often ask myself, why are some men so afraid of women? Why? I mean, why do we have all these awful cultural symbols, you know? Mr. Sykes, look how he describes us. She-devils, snake-filled heads. I don't think he knows about the Medusa, for example, but all these terrible, so that fear shows in part the weakness as well as the strength of the system. But to go more directly, I think when we speak as women, we also remember intersectionality. Thank you, Kimberly Crenshaw. So I am a woman, yes. Actually, I'm a cisgender woman. And that is my gender identity and my biological identity more or less cohere, although I think my family might have something to say about that. But you remember your other elements of identity. And that, I think, helps to prevent reinforcing the binary. Where you say, yes, and this happened to me, but I'm also, these are my other elements of identity. These are the other structures to which I am connected. And I think that act of complexity helps to keep you from collapsing back into the binary. So the great song, the great second wave song, I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar. What is it, something to? Well, let's just play it on the sound system La Pietra tomorrow. But anyway, but I am woman and I am this and I am that and I am this and I am that as well. And I think that leads to one thing I respect, so one reason why I believe in democracy despite the growing authoritarianism of governments. No one's mixture is exactly the same. Zora Neale Hurston, the great African-American writer, talks about her identity being a bag, and she opens up the bag, and inside there's a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And when we actually look at our identity, which is changing as well, then you get to the irreducible sense of self. That irreducible sense of self. And that irreducible sense of self and the importance of self is the basis of human rights and the basis of democracy. Do you want the mic for that? No. Okay, say it again. I am woman, hear me roar. All right. That's enough of the musical theater. But does that make sense to you? Yes, sir.
Students, where are you?
But you're a student. I see lots of people I would identify as. One element of identity is student, this whole role. You're all students, right?
Is there someone else who wants to?
No.
You mentioned despite the fact that you're hopeful, we are not quite there yet. Now, if you could put yourself back in the beginning of this period, 1968, how have we done so far? Are we ahead of where you thought at the time we would be or behind? And specifically, what areas do you think we have done better than others?
Another wonderful question, and I thank you all for the thoughtfulness of your questions. I think, quite frankly, you have to take it nation by nation. Because despite globalization, we're still nationals. You know, I keep thinking of the passport as a marker of identity, and the passport is national, not global. What have we done? What's happened since '68 in certain countries? I think the notion of equal rights has become far more embedded. That notion of equal rights between the races, among the genders, I think it's become much more of our political discourse. Secondly, I think the laws about sexual violence, the rape laws, are far more in place. In the United States, the notion of rape in marriage as well as outside of marriage is embedded, and I think that sense that a woman's body, a woman must give consent, I think that's much more embedded. In terms of education, that there are women in the professions in a way they were not. I found it really interesting that the two judges in the Michigan courtroom cases that were listening to the victim impact statements against Larry Nassar, they were both women. So I think there are more women in greater positions. And I think that's certainly three of the accomplishments as one looks back. But what's also happened is there's always something new to worry about. And when I think of the fourth wave, and those of you, whether you like the term or not, you are fourth wavers. And you may not like the term, so throw it out. But what's happened, of course, is new things that have to be incorporated. And one of them is certainly climate change. And the fact that we live in the Anthropocenic age. So if I were a fourth waver rather than a second waver, I would look back on certain reasons for hope because things have been accomplished. But I would also look that I have to worry about climate, and I have to think seriously about social media. And how much control do I want about social media? What do I want? Because the fourth wavers are the great digital natives. And this is something to think about in a way that we digital immigrants can think about, but we don't, it's not at our fingertips. It's just not at our fingertips. I think for all of us, but this is related to first, second, third, and fourth wave feminism. I would suggest to you, maybe not in China, which has officially gender equality and has had ever since the Communist Revolution, although it has a feminist movement predating that. There is a rise of authoritarian governments. Trump. Women voted for Trump, men voted for Trump. And there are reasons why. I mean, I'm not going to dismiss this election as an aberration, and I'm not going to say he's crazy. I don't think he is. I think that's an easy way of dismissing him. You will have to tell me about Berlusconi. But I look at what's happening in Poland, where a great issue is women's bodies, the return of abortion. I look at what's happening in Hungary, at Orban. Orban, of course, his great focus of attack is Central European University and education and free speech. I look at Venezuela. And are anybody here from Venezuela? Anybody here from Latin America? Will you help me on this one? Venezuela was a complicated country, right? It got oil, but it still had an elite. But now it's a terrible authoritarian government. Would you agree? Yeah. So you look at Venezuela, and many of these authoritarian governments build not only on immigration now, but also build on women's notions of nationhood. They're also building on women's bodies, the control of women's bodies. You tell me about Berlusconi and women's bodies. I mean, it's a complicated. Would it be fair to say, you instruct me on this? Berlusconi and women's bodies is to make them, make the network women bimbos, but also to see women's bodies as an instrument of men's pleasure. And he's very heteronormative. I mean, has Berlusconi ever been seen kissing a man? Thought, ooh. So this is so that I'm chair of the board of something called Scholars at Risk. And our job is to help scholars, and by that freedom of speech, who must escape from the governments that are persecuting them. And there are more governments that I like than I would prefer to see. So,
Sure.
So that's what I'm, so I work to be done, and yet we're here. Hey, make it a good one.
Thanks for speaking
No pressure.
with us.
No pressure.
Yeah, thanks for speaking with us about this important subject. You spoke about intersectionality, and I was wondering, because a lot of black feminists and ethnic minority feminists denounce the fact that intersectionality has been sort of reappropriated by white feminists. And so I was wondering, what's your opinion about how we can find a balance between finding a common ground for meaningful alliances and common fight for the feminist cause, and the representation of diversity without versing into essentialism?
Again, terrific questions. I think diversity properly done is an argument in and of itself against essentialism. It is because diversity properly done shows the multiplicity of identities and the historical nature of the construction of identity. So if you do diversity properly, you're always conscious of those two things. And that helps to argue against essentialism. So I think always keeping those two things in mind. You asked several questions about intersectionality, and it's absolutely true that Kimberly Crenshaw, the wonderful law professor who really gave us the term intersectionality, was a black woman. And then it's true that we all use it now. So what's the appropriate thing to do? How does one behave properly in this case? One is always to understand where the term comes from and to understand the source of virtue. So you notice tonight, I tried to say, Kimberly Crenshaw, to always acknowledge the fountain, the original fountain of goodness, and always to build that in. And always also to remember Zora Neale Hurston in that essay about who's me, just this bundle of stuff. The second thing that you ask is really about the question of appropriation. That is so complicated, but thank you for asking it. One of the things that's so interesting now about certain African American artists is their appropriation of white images. The picture of Napoleon is as black. So that is a kind of appropriation that is sassy and self-conscious and used for the sake of a larger cultural and aesthetic purpose. I think we must not appropriate unless it's done in a spirit of self-consciousness, because appropriation by definition has a quality of, there's an implication of use about it. But at the same time, I do want to use the concept of intersectionality. So let's go back, and this may amuse you, let's go back to the concept of copyright law. And copyright law, now help me here, Ellen, copyright law has the concept of fair use. And what is the concept of fair use? It's when you use and give credit or even a royalty, even a little royalty payment. So you take it, but you always say where it comes from. Now, what about our current culture? And again, you all have to help me on this. We live in a culture of mixing and sampling. And you listen to a DJ, and there's a lot of sampling, right? Well, the DJ doesn't stop and say, by the way, I just sampled and mixed. So it really, because we live in a culture of sampling and mixing and collage, we have to be very careful when we take something to acknowledge it. It's just one of the acts of taking care that we have to do. And in that act of taking care, I, as a white woman, always have to ask myself, am I taking that from a group that historically had less power than my group did? You know, look at where was the group? Where did that come from? And am I taking this? Am I taking this from someone who has not given me a cent to use it? But I think with the concept of intersectionality, a cent has been given to use it as long as the appropriation is not thoughtless and careless and exploitative. And that, I think, you're capable of doing. Your very question makes me think you are capable of doing that.
So, woke you all up, didn't I? Just want to thank you, Kate, for joining us tonight, starting a conversation which will continue tomorrow night. I hope you all join us again tomorrow night on the same topic from a different national perspective.
Yeah, and get the inside story of those fabulous demonstrations.
Yeah.
Where they all marched down the streets of Rome dressed as flowers, shouting a rather raucous verse about the Pope.
Yeah.
It was not Pope Francis, I hasten to
Yes.
add. It was a Pope more deserving of questioning than the great man of our time. Or at least I think so.
But thank you again. Please join me in thanking
thank
Kate
you
for
all.
coming.
Thank you for your. Thank you.